Is this on, or do I need to use
This
that?
one is on. Yeah, that's, and then if you want to move this one.
No, I don't. Good evening. Welcome to one of the discussions this evening. It's part of a series on civil rights in America under the title theme of The New Faces of Civil Rights. My name is Patricia Maulden. I'm faculty at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and I'm looking forward to a really engaging discussion and some really strong panel discussions. Tonight we're going to examine the discourse on Islam in American politics and the impact that that has on communities. The event is sponsored by the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, University Life, the Ali Vural Ak Center for Global Islamic Studies, and the Dialogue and Difference Project at George Mason. Tomorrow on the Diversity, Inclusion in Higher Education event, Alvin Nadura is going to speak about exactly that. How do we engage educationally with diversity? How do we increase diversity on campus and the discussion thereof? And also focusing on Dr. King and his legacy and the current social movements. And that discussion will be led by Johnny Mack and Dan Rothbart.
Hi, so who you're hearing from right now is your two faculty facilitators for the evening tonight. So my name is Mara Schoeny. I'm one of the, another faculty along with Patricia here at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And I want to tell you a little bit about how the event tonight will be framed, the process that we'll use. So in just a moment, I'm going to invite up one of our folks on stage here to introduce the speakers for the evening. Each of the speakers will have about 5 to 7 minutes to have your own piece, and then we've collected some questions from people as they registered, as they RSVP'd. So we'll start off with a few questions just to get the panel warmed up, and then we're going to open it up for the audience as well. When we turn over to audience questions, we do have microphones that we can pass around the audience, so we'll have some folks out in the seats who will be able to help you make sure that your voice is heard. The other thing I want to do is thank the organizers for the events. This has been a group effort, a lot of good ideas amongst a number of people. So I want to make sure that we note that it takes some work and many people to pull something off and to be able to think of a compelling topic and how we could bring it to the audience. And I think Remaz will say a little bit more about that. So it's my pleasure now. I would like to introduce Remaz Abdelgader. She is going to introduce the panelists. She is a senior at Mason. She is a major with our program, undergraduate program at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And she's also doing 2 minors, Immigration Studies and Pre-Law. Last year she was one of the first of our Peace Building Fellow cohort. So, Remaz.
Assalamu alaikum, and that translates into may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. This is the Islamic greeting. So I'm going to begin by just defining Islamophobia. Islamophobia is a contrived fear or prejudice fomented by the existing Eurocentric and Orientalist global power structure. It is directed at a perceived or real Muslim threat through the maintenance and extension of existing disparities in economic, political, social, and or cultural relations, while rationalizing the necessity to deploy violence as a tool to achieve. As conflict majors, one of the first initial concepts we've learned was that physical atrocities don't just occur overnight. Their orchestration and implementation takes many steps, and the actual physical violence and or ethnic cleansing is the final step. Gregory Stanton, the founder of Genocide Watch, identified the 10 stages of genocide. And the first 6 stages, tragically, we have observed and have very well been established in the America and its Muslim problem case. From the classifications of Muslims as anti-peace, anti-West, anti-human life, and currently being labeled as savages in a leading anti-Muslim campaign by Pamela Geller, convincing mainstream America that Muslims have one ideology, and that this ideology is one that of its root character is an inherently violent ideology. This is what allows for mainstream America to begin to fear, where we begin to distinguish ourselves in an us versus them categorization. Symbolizations of Muslims as terrorists, those whom cause terror and have a perpetual, hateful vendetta against the West. Once mainstream media spews this rhetoric, and what's worse, presidential candidates, such as Ben Carson, Donald Trump, who then take on this rhetoric, these politicians then begin to utilize fear-mongering to further the extent of the discrimination against Muslims. We see this in the case in New York, North Carolina, and many other states, where now some stores and businesses have begun to display "No Muslims Allowed" signs posted in front of their doors and in their neighborhoods. This same form of discrimination was observed in the Jews' Holocaust and the African American Holocaust and other atrocities like in my native country of Sudan. In these recent events of ISIS, we've seen both the Sikh community and the Muslim community being the victims of these atrocities and the backlash. Some have died from being pushed into the subways, attacked for being Muslims, and other extreme forms of racism. When we dehumanize a group based on our fear, our ability to make informed and rational decisions is diminished. As a conflict major, I realized that the political rhetoric is dangerous and shouldn't be taken so lightly. Hitler was able to mobilize his group of people based on this rhetoric that he was spewing. And people were actually looking up to him, were inspired by his rhetoric, who then took the actions against their own neighbors, co-workers, and even classmates. If we begin to institutionalize xenophobia and apparently discriminatory policies and tell the American nation that it is okay for us to be fearful of the Muslims and or immigrant problem, this is what perpetuates and mobilizes hate and eventually ethnic cleansing and or genocide. These are the crucial steps that must happen first. Donald Trump is currently at the forefront of the poll because of his anti-Muslim sentiments, claiming to make America great again, proposing policies to temporarily ban Muslims from entering America, and to also create a special registry for American Muslims. In a dichotomy identity that I currently hold of being Black, Muslim, and a woman, an identity comprised of three minorities that make it hard to exist in a so-called post-racial and non-racist society. I find it tragic and sad that I'm always asked to prove the extent of my peacefulness to you. I find it tragic that the world constantly expects me to denounce violence and or to scream and shout, "I am nothing like those Muslims who've committed those atrocities. We are peaceful Muslims, I promise." That's the same as asking any ethnic group when a crime is committed by their group to denounce acts of violence which are inherently violent. I find it ironic that I must try to get the whole world to see me as a non-threat, peaceful and the loving person that I am, that I must file my claim of peace and tolerance and love to an intolerant society. It's very sad that I am being asked to prove that I am harmless, just so that I can sedate your fear of my violence, in hopes that while I sedate your fear, my fear of a dangerous reality is sedated as well. My fear of being attacked for my Muslim identity and the poisonous rep it has received. I am afraid of your fear, creeping over into your head and allowing you to make misinformed decisions that can endanger my safety. But do you see what's happening? They're making us fear each other, which entails hating one another, further distancing us apart. Brothers and sisters of all races, all genders, and all religions, it's time to be united. If there's a time for unity and love, it's now. This is why I believe that this community dialogue here tonight is a fundamental step in beginning to get us to turn face and practice self-reflexivity, eradicating the fear of the other. And with me here today is an esteemed panel with community leaders and experts. First one tonight is Imam Johari Abdul-Malik. He is the Director of Outreach at the Darul Hijrah Islamic Center and former Muslim chaplain at Howard University. He was the first Muslim officially installed as a chaplain in higher education at Howard University, and is currently the head of the National Association of Muslim Chaplains in Higher Education. The Imam also serves as the chair of government relations for the Muslim Alliance in North America. He is the director of community outreach for the Hijrah community and the president of the Muslim Society of Washington, Inc. Next on our panel, we have Nathan Lean. He's a writer and a scholar of the Middle East. He's the director of research at Georgetown University's Bridge Initiative. He's the author of 3 books, including the award-winning The Islamophobia Industry. His work has been featured in the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and the New York Daily News, CNN, Salon, and the Christian Science Monitor, among others. He lives in Washington, D.C. Third on our panel is a colleague of mine and a personal friend, Asha Noor. Asha Noor works as a civic engagement and advocacy specialist with Take On Hate campaign. Asha has a master's degree from the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University and is a Somali-American activist based out in the D.C. metro area. She received her bachelor's degree from Michigan State University in political science and pre-law in 2012. She worked with Islamic Relief USA, where she gained an extensive understanding of Middle East conflict and international humanitarian issues. I hope you guys enjoy our panel tonight, and we have 2 great moderators, Patricia Maulden, who was a professor of mine. I think I was a great student, right? And Dr. Schoeny, who's also wonderful. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. 5 minutes, right? In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. First, I probably want to say that I'm honored, as the others are honored, to be with you tonight. And to recognize that not only is America becoming increasingly intolerant, but that the world itself is becoming radically intolerant of the other. So much so that perhaps some are saying that the acts of violence most notably make us feel that perhaps we're approaching World War III. There's almost probably no part of the world right now that is not involved in some form of violence, and particularly fueled by a kind of intolerance. And probably in no time in our history has the human race been more drawn closely together as a global village. And that's why that the work that's being done here around conflict resolution and analysis is so critically important. I was saying if I was younger, I probably would matriculate and be your student. Dr. King reminds us, and this is a week we've been celebrating the legacy of the civil rights movement, saying that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, bound in a single garment of destiny, that what affects one of us directly affects all of us indirectly. The famous quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And I say that now because as we're looking at Islamophobia, one as a construct, as was mentioned before, phobia, the irrational fear that psychiatrists use as a term to describe a kind of mental illness that is disabling. And so Islamophobia is an irrational fear of Muslims and Islam, but let us not forget that it is rooted somehow in certain facts that help to perpetuate this phobia. On the other hand, there is also the issue that we have to face, and that is the issue of injustice, both locally and internationally. Because this is part of the fuel that is feeding the fear and phobia, either among those who are Muslim or those who are of other traditions. And unfortunately, the other side of the Islamophobic pendulum, in my estimation, is radicalization. So now, as I close, I think I'm close to closing. What do I have? I have, wow, 4 minutes. Oh, that's not the watch. My watch must be running fast. And so we are placed in a situation where, as those of us, I believe, who are conscious, are obligated to organize in between the polar extremes of either violent extremist radicals on the one hand and Islamophobes on the other. We are seeing now a kind of a radical and violent state-sponsored terrorism in the form of militarism. And so when you see drone attacks and other things internationally, know that they have an effect on those people that in turn creates the fear that produces the Islamophobia and individuals who will act out. Since I have a couple of extra minutes, I want to remind you of some American history that maybe we forgot. That in the 1960s, the late 60s, early 70s, there was a group called the Students for Democratic Society, SDS. They were students in Berkeley, California, I believe, and they were frustrated by the inability to affect the change in foreign policy that was feeding the war in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. Some of them broke off from that group and became part of the Weather Underground, violent extremists. So within this sort of response to the irrational fear that promoted the Vietnam War, that was the fear of communists then. We are finding many people who are sympathetic to the crisis internationally, some of whom who are not even Muslim, Jihad Jain or others. And the presence of those individuals, then Pamela Geller and others will say, well, all of them are like that. I want to remind us as we move forward that it is a requirement, therefore, as we look at poverty in the form of global economic exploitation and environmental degradation. Let us not forget, while we are having a discussion about a global village that we live in, there are some who want to deny global warming while it is creating the civil wars and conflicts in other parts of the world fighting over resources, whether it's in the Palestinian, Israeli, and the Transjordan community fighting over water rights, whether it is Somalia facing the degradation of its seas from toxic waste being dumped, whether it is individuals in the end of what do they call it, the Indo-Pak region, so that in Bangladesh, the floods are becoming, it's because of our inability to respond to climate change. All of this, brothers and sisters, is connected in a way, 1 minute, see, I told you, is connected in a way so that when we see the manifestations of Islamophobia on one hand, the political rhetoric on the other, part of it is a mask to make us feel who live in the middle disempowered. I would call on us to say tonight that as active citizens we're going to support a movement for freedom, justice, and equality, for understanding and cooperation in an increasingly diverse community in America and around the world, to recognize that proximity without knowledge and engagement creates conflict, and that proximity with knowledge and engagement builds community. So I'm going to close with that and to say to you tonight that you and I, who live in the middle, I pray, will hold the ground for real civic engagement and social change, because we have to be the real voice of the future. If we don't fight together, I'm afraid that we will lose from both the extremes that wish not to resolve this conflict. Thank you so much. You get to go boy, girl.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Asha Noor. I was, as Remaz said, a student here at George Mason University at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. And I'm starting to think that Imam Johari also has a degree in conflict, because he was spitting some truth. I mean, he knew exactly what he was talking about. So we appreciate that. I wanted to thank us. I did used to be his student, and I will say that I've learned a lot from Imam Johari. Oh, wow, okay, I'm glad to hear that. So today we're here to talk about Islamophobia and political rhetoric. If there wasn't such negative narratives and destructive dialogue going on today and such a negative political climate, we wouldn't have this discussion today. And I feel that a lot of individuals don't realize that comments that Donald Trump or Sarah Palin or the far right make have consequences. So in the last 2 months, there have been over 60 reported crimes of committed against Muslims, Arabs, and those perceived to be, including the Sikh community. So that's a span of 2 months. So that means statistically every single day someone is harmed because of their race, their religion, their ethnicity, and their background. So we might look at these political leaders and think it's a circus and kind of funny, but it's not. Cultural violence, which is a term I'm sure half of this room here from SCAR would understand, leads to direct and physical violence. It's something that affects us on the daily, and being Muslim in America, this is a very difficult time. And this is more so an issue for Muslim women, because to be a Muslim woman and to be visibly Muslim, you are now a target. I don't want to be daunting, I don't want to be a cynic, but 60 crimes in a span of 2 months. That's just something I want to let you guys kind of think about for a second before I proceed. So as Remaz stated, I am working on the campaign to take on hate, and one of the major projects that we're working on is combating this destructive narrative around Islamophobia. And a lot of the projects that we do is dealing with policies that affect Muslims disproportionately. So this week in Senate, they're voting on a SAFE Act, which will bar immigrants from coming to this country. Let that sink in. It's 2016. Are we really considering barring immigrants from coming to this country? And the fact that these policies are even being discussed shows that Islamophobia and racism aren't just negative comments that you make to someone because you dislike them. They're deeply rooted in our institutions. Islamophobia is not a new phenomenon. It is rooted in white supremacy. It is rooted in racism. It is a common enemy. So I feel that in order to better understand Islamophobia, you have to understand white supremacy. You have to understand the process in which it is upheld in this country through policies, through institutions, de facto programs. It is something that I feel people don't engage or look at critically. And furthermore, there is definitely an issue in terms of understanding the racial nuances when it comes to Islamophobia. So there is this misconception that most Muslims in America are from the Middle East or are from South Asian countries. And that in itself adds to this negative narrative, because when you think of Muslims as being only Arab and South Asian, you automatically put them in a group of new immigrant Muslims. There's nothing wrong with that. However, we have to understand that 30 to 40% of the Muslims that were, 30 to 40% of the slaves that were brought to this country from West Africa were Muslim. So Islam and Muslims are as American as anything else in this country. So for someone to say, go back to your country, or assimilate, or move beyond your backward religion, no, actually I won't. And I won't allow you to tell me that my religion is a backward religion. This country was built literally on the back of slaves and therefore built on the back of Muslims. So I feel that going beyond the narrative that Muslims are only Arab and South Asian shows that, again, Muslims are part of the fabric of this country, and that's something that needs to be part of the discourse. Looking at this stage right now, it's me, Imam Johari, and Remaz. We're 3 Black Muslim Americans. What people don't understand is 1/3 of the Muslims in America today are Black. Do you see that represented in media? No. When there is an attack somewhere carried out by Daesh or Boko Haram, and Muslims have to scramble and go to CNN and condemn it and apologize and unintentionally assume guilt, who do you see? You see an Arab or a South Asian. That is erasure of the Black community. And so I think that is definitely problematic in this country, and I hope that's something that we move beyond. Circling back to condemning. So there is definitely a divide in the Muslim community in terms of how to react when an act of terrorism is carried out in the name of Islam. My stance, and not with my organization because I'm speaking as Asha Noor, my stance is no, I will not condemn an act carried out by ISIS. I will not condemn an act carried out by Daesh. Do I support these acts? No. Do I think that they're abhorrent? Yes. But will I stand here and say that I apologize for an act carried out for people who do not represent me, do not represent my religion, and have absolutely nothing to do with me? No, I won't. And I feel that a lot of the organizations that do this perpetuate the conflation of the Arab and Muslim identity with terrorism. So please stop if you do this. I don't want to name organizations that do this, but please stop. Because you don't see when a white Christian male blows up an abortion clinic or shoots up individuals at an abortion clinic, which is disgusting, but you don't see the white male Christian majority apologizing and saying, I condemn these acts of terrorism carried out by my race. You really don't. And if you do, I'd love to see that post. So that is something that is definitely part of the discourse today in Islamophobia, but it looks as though I'm going to be wrapping up. So I just pretty much want to end on that note that in this difficult time with this negative political rhetoric, the only bit of advice that I can give anyone is to go out, meet a Muslim, go out and go beyond your horizons, go to events, just like this one, for example. And I applaud SCAR for having such a wonderful event. But I also challenge SCAR and other academic institutions to have, to reflect some of the dialogues that they have. Maybe having staff that's actually Muslim or Black or foreign immigrants might actually speak to dismantling and destructing the systems of white supremacy that we speak against. So I think that reflection is key. So in my time at SCAR, I learned a lot of wonderful things. I had amazing professors, amazing guidance, but I didn't see anyone that looked like me. So I think that we need to start from the inside out, and we need to keep our institutions accountable. And if we're going to learn about Islam and race, we should have people of color teach about Islam and race. And that's all I will end with. Thank you.
Good evening. I'd like to thank the organizers. It's an honor to be here, especially with these esteemed panelists. I'm going to recount a story here. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. Alan Paton is the author. And in his novel, But Your Land is Beautiful, he tells this story of a man named Robert Mansfield, who is a white man from South Africa. Mansfield was the headmaster of a white school who took his athletic teams to play hockey against black schools. But eventually the Department of Education told him that he could no longer do this. And in protest, he resigned. So shortly thereafter, a man named Emmanuel Neen, who's a black leader, black community leader, comes to meet this headmaster at his school. And he shows up at his office and he says to him, I've come here to see the man who resigns his job because he doesn't wish to obey an order that will prevent children from playing with one another. And so Mansfield says, well, I resign because I think it's time to go out and fight everything that separates people from one another. Do I look like a knight in shining armor, he asks. And so the black activist says, yes, you do. You look like a knight in shining armor, but you're going to get wounded. Do you know that? And Mansfield says, yes, I expect that that may happen. And so the black activist says, well, you expect correctly. People don't like what you're doing. But I'm thinking of joining you in your battle. And so the headmaster looks at him with some puzzlement and says, so you're going to wear the shining armor too then, are you? And the black community leader responded and said, yes, and I'm going to get wounded. I'm going to get wounded, not only by the government, but by my own people as well. And so the headmaster asks him, well, are you worried about the wounds? And the black community leader replied, I don't worry about the wounds. When I get up there, which is my intention, the Holy One will ask me this: where are your wounds? Where are your wounds? And if I say I haven't any, he will ask me one more question. Then was there nothing on earth worth fighting for? And so I want to begin tonight by asking you all this question: where are your wounds? Where are your wounds? Here we are, friends, to spend an evening talking about the phenomenon of Islamophobia. And indeed, it is worth talking about. It's a prejudice that is very real. It's one that's certainly worth fighting for, or fighting against, I should say, and worth being wounded over even. But in the shadow of the holiday commemorating one of our nation's most powerful and influential moral giants, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as our brothers and sisters in Flint, Michigan, which is 60% black, are fighting tonight as we sit here for the right to something that is as basic and fundamental to human life as uncontaminated drinking water. In a society where we have to remind ourselves on social media, some 50 years or more after the Civil Rights Movement, that yes, black lives matter. In a country that is ranked 74th out of 145 countries in terms of wage equality, where women will have to wait until the year 2133 to earn as much as their male peers, where guns have killed more people in the past 50 years than all U.S. wars combined. In a country where, it seems at least, the love of power far outweighs the power of love, where we invest more in our military than the next 7 countries combined and less in diplomacy, in a country that dropped 23,000 bombs on Muslim-majority nations around the world in 2015 alone, but yet 33 million of our own people still live without health insurance, where matters of matrimony, who you can and cannot love, who you can and cannot marry, are determined by the state, where our political leaders in an election season tell us who to hate, and large swaths of our compatriots listen. We must fight, not to reverse one injustice, not to reverse the injustice that we champion, but to triumph over all injustices. Because Islamophobia is as much a black issue as racism is a Muslim issue. Islamophobia is as much a women's rights issue as wage inequality is a Muslim issue. Corporate greed, climate change, homelessness, poverty, lack of access to education should be of concern to those of us who care about Islamophobia as much as Islamophobia should be the fight of anti-Wall Streeters and those who lobby for a range of other issues or fight against other issues. And I believe that progress on any issue is progress for all issues. So with that, I want to encourage us tonight to think about Islamophobia in its broadest terms and think about the ways that these prejudices are interconnected and how we all might work together to ensure that our society is an equal and just place for all people and a society where, yes, we are all wounded because we care about this society. I believe that a world that is free of Islamophobia, free of other prejudices, is a world where we are wounded, and we should be. Thank you.
So we're at the point now where we have some questions that were collected beforehand that we thought we'd start the panel off with. We didn't talk about who's starting that, so we're planning this a little bit as we go along. Okay. All right. So let me go back to where we started a little bit at the beginning. Remaz gave us a definition of Islamophobia. And some of the questions that had been collected beforehand asked about the definitions of Islamophobia. Is it the same? Why that term? How is it similar or different than labeling something as racism or xenophobia, anti-religious as discrimination? And so I wonder if the panel could speak to a little bit of how do you define this phenomena, and what does it matter what terms, how we label the problems that we're currently facing around the political rhetoric around Islam right now?
Thank you. I think it's an excellent question. And it's quite honestly a question that I get asked a lot. Islamophobia is not a perfect term. And so I think that that's a sort of straw man argument that we need to get out of the way. You know, the etymological components of it render it useless somehow. That's not true. It's a term that is becoming used more frequently. And so we shouldn't necessarily start back at ground zero and come up with these alternative phrases that we're going to have to labor to inject into the American lexicon. I think that that's a fool's errand. A little bit of history, if I can. The word Islamophobia actually, the first use of it goes back quite a ways in history, to 1910. It was first used in a French publication. Two French authors, in fact, were commenting on the experiences of West Africans under colonial rule. And they used the term Islamophobie, the French version of the word. And that was a derivative, it is thought, at least by linguists, a derivative of Judeophobie, which later morphed into what we now call anti-Semitism. And that was a derivative of the word xenophobie, or what we refer to as xenophobia. So there is, I think, sort of a trajectory in terms of the use of that word, how it came to be. And you can see how it did naturally evolve from other similar prejudices. Personally, and this is also the definition that applies to the Bridge Initiative at Georgetown University, for whom I work, we describe Islamophobia as prejudice or discrimination against Muslims based on their religious identity or perceived religious identity. And that last part is important because we heard mention earlier this evening of the Sikh community and attacks that have faced them in the wake of anti-Muslim rhetoric. And so that's, I think, an important aspect of that. I'll let others weigh in, though, now.
So the question was, again, how do you define Islamophobia? And the term, would it describe racism, xenophobia, anti-religious sentiment? I thought for myself that this is such an intersectional identity that I feel that it includes racism, xenophobia, and anti-religious sentiment. But in this most basic definition, Islamophobia is the fear of Muslims or those perceived to be Muslim or Arab. And again, going to what Nathan said, it's very key that we add that portion of those perceived to be Muslim because the Sikh community, again, gets a brunt of a lot of the backlash, and they also face a lot of hate crimes because people cannot understand that Sikhs are actually not Muslim or Arab, but so definitely they are a part of this struggle with us. And I thought, well, for me, again, it's an intersectional phenomenon, and I face all aspects of this question, as do 1/3 of the Muslims in this country. 1/3, again, of the Muslims in this country are black. They face racism and anti-Muslim racism, and maybe even xenophobia if they happen to be immigrants like myself and my family. So this just goes back to the point that Islam is not a monolith. And Muslims are not one group of people. We are 1.7 billion people. We have different races, genders, orientation. So to say that Islamophobia is just one very singular definition is wrong. Muslims are part of so many different identities, and Islamophobia affects, again, so many different type of people.
I think basically I agree with the preceding comments, but I would like to say two things about the power of words. One of the issues is that for Muslims, the Quran is revealed in the Arabic language. It is a language that has a great degree of precision and specificity. English, on the other hand, lacks some specificity. For anybody who's ever, as a non-English speaker, ever try to learn English, or you try to teach somebody English and you say, well, there, and there, and they're like, okay. There's so many words that we have that are just, for people trying to learn English, they're like, how can I explain? So, while we are having to accept certain terminology like Islamophobia because it's in the parlance, I believe that we really are losing the war of words with both the extreme right, that is the sort of Pam Geller group, and the radical left. Let's take the word jihad. The news likes to use the word, these people are jihadists. The people who are committing these atrocities in the name of Islam, and they kill mostly innocent Muslim men and women of different ethnicities, but they like to be called jihadists because they believe that that is a badge of honor that goes to someone who is really dedicated to give their life for their faith. Those of us who are in the middle are trying to say, well, what do? We don't want to, if we call them jihadists, then that means that we think they're bad. But if we call them jihadists, then they'll think that we think that they're good. We really have to take back the mantle of language. I want to offer you one of those tonight. How many of you here tonight are non-Muslims? Raise your hand. Stop. I'm not a non-white person. I am what I am. When we fall into this ability to accept, Malcolm X said, they called me nigger so much I thought it was my name. It is not a good thing to be referred to as a non-something. I am a Muslim. He has his own values, faiths, traditions. Let us at least take back part of the language that joins us together to say we are people of other faiths, other traditions, other convictions, that we're not Muslim and non-Muslim. It's not Islam, Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Iman, the places of faith, Dar al-Kufr, the places of war. This loss in the precision of words allows those who would like to divide us an opportunity to win.
Thank you. This is on. So in the individual comments and in some of the discussion right now, I heard some of the words, oh heavens, where'd they go? Interconnectivity, the mutuality, and can be used in negative ways and in positive ways. And we've heard a lot about some of the very serious negatives. I'm interested, and one of the questions on the list focuses on some of the interventions or processes or approaches that you have used to counter the negative aspects and to use mutuality, connectivity in a more positive way, or in a way in using the bridge word to somehow bridge or to create an understanding or a beginning of an understanding. How to enter into that space of understanding. We'd be really interested to hear some of your comments about that, or some of the difficulties perhaps as well.
Sure. I can offer a few remarks to that end. In case you haven't noticed, I have a strong Southern drawl, right? And so this world in which I live, and what I mean by that is this sort of intellectual space that I occupy, studying issues related to the Middle East, studying the religion of Islam, and especially Islamophobia. An awful lot of people say, how did a Southern guy like you get interested in a topic like that? You can't know how many people have asked me that question, and I don't know exactly what the reasons for their sort of cognitive dissonance are, but that's pretty much nail on the head. But what I have found effective is speaking to people in language and using themes that they understand. And here's what I mean by this. When I go back home to North Carolina, and I'm having a conversation with someone about what I do, and it's a little bit tense at the beginning, because I don't know whether I want to bring up the topic of Islamophobia. It's a topic that has a political resonance, and so, there's some sensitivity there. But usually what I do in these situations is I try to couch it in terms of American values, right? The founding fathers, religious freedom, the pillars of this great nation in which we live. And if you can touch on themes of patriotism that resonate especially with Southern, perhaps more conservative audiences, then you bring them to the conversation by starting it out like that. And if you can couch Islamophobia in that way and say, look, in this great nation in which we live, the antithesis of this great nation's values is to prejudice particular minorities, right? That's not what the Founding Fathers were all about. That's not what we mean when we say we're a nation of religious freedom. If I'm speaking to a Catholic audience, for instance, that might be more conservative or might have some questions related to Islamophobia, I think it's particularly helpful to remind them of their own experiences here in this country in the 1800s, when fears of Irish immigrants to the United States ran rampant, and then again in the 1960 presidential election, when John Kennedy was accused of bringing in the values of the Vatican. You know, that he was a plant, a mole, right? That the Pope would run the United States. And there were all sorts of nasty, negative cartoons and narratives in the media that were quite prominent then. And so I think if you can find ways to start the conversation about Islamophobia that hit home with the particular communities, the particular people with whom you're speaking, that is the best way to bring them to the conversation, and then I think show them, without beating them over the head, of the ugliness of this form of prejudice.
I agree with Nathan and some of the points that he made. A lot of this transformation begins at home, right? So when you go home for Thanksgiving dinner and you know that some of your relatives are anti-Muslim or anti-black or anti-gay or you name it, right? Are you going to have that discussion with them? Are you going to talk to them about it? Are you going to shy away from it? Are you going to be here fall and spring semester as an activist running around DC with posters, but the second you go back to Georgia, you're not going to say anything to your parents, you're not going to have these difficult discussions? That is what I call a non-racist. But an anti-racist is someone that is willing to have these difficult discussions and engage in these uncomfortable dialogues no matter where you are. It doesn't matter if your mother is extremely racist and doesn't want to hear it. If you're going to be there for Thanksgiving dinner, don't fake the front. Don't be here Monday through Friday at SCAR or whatever institution you're at and, you know, Black Lives Matter, but when you're home for Thanksgiving, watch football and, like, not talk about these discussions. Nothing against football, obviously. But so I think a lot of these discussions begin. So a lot of these discussions definitely start at home. And I would disagree with one point you made, but I think that you were making it to paint this image for some people in the South. But when people say that, you know, this negative rhetoric is very un-American, actually it is very American. Racism, unfortunately, is rooted in the American fabric. When the Founding Fathers were establishing, you know, these religious freedoms, it wasn't for black individuals. They were seen as cattle and eventually 3/5 of a person. So definitely, I mean, it's not funny, it's actually quite sad. But so it's definitely, I would say, not un-American. It's very American, and you know this. So that's the issue. It's the status quo. And I feel that a lot of these discussions here, this dialogue, dinners back home, Thanksgiving, will definitely challenge the status quo, and that is our duty as activists, educators, writers, is to challenge that status quo.
Probably there is one criticism I have, and that is, at least so far, we seem to be sort of, you know, the peacenik type group. I'll give you a statement from Dr. King. He said, "We will soon forget the words of our enemies, but we will long remember the silence of our friends." Change is really what happens at the water fountain when the colleague is saying to the other person, the student, saying, you know, man, Muslims, man, they need to, you know, I just need to give it up, man. Look at that, right? They see something on the news, you're sitting watching, you know, the television, CNN or something, and you hear somebody make a comment, And really what they're doing is they're calling you out, right? Are you going to go along with the lynching or not? Right? We about to lynch somebody. What you going to say, Billy Bob? I ain't saying nothing, man. I'm just, I was just on my way to the grocery store. I don't have anything to do with this. That is how it happens. If we want it to stop happening, then we have to be willing to engage that space in order to be, I believe, really citizens of a free society. If we don't do it, then actually we're turning it over to the Nazis. Somebody said to a journalist that they were down in the South. They said, you know what, journalists, Donald Trump, I'm so proud of him. He reminds me of George Wallace. And they were proud, as if they were living in a space where it would be everybody, nobody's going to say, hey, George, what are you talking about? Even George Wallace repented, right? And you still drinking the old Kool-Aid. So I'm saying to you, the real activism, there's some people who will be full-time activists. The rest of you are going to do whatever your regular job is and have a life and work. We're asking you to be active citizens. Don't get sucked into the ESPN zone because you think you can't make a difference. And that's how it works. I'm going to give you another one. The example that you gave on John F. Kennedy has an interesting relationship to Islamophobia today. John F. Kennedy was at that time considered to be young people's candidate. He was considered to be women's candidate in an election in which statistically women would vote for the first time differently than their fathers and their husbands. At the dawn of the women's rights movement, and at a time when safe and effective oral contraception was going to come on to the landscape. So it was going to sexually liberate women. So they said, we know Kennedy's going to get the women's vote. And whatever Negroes can vote, they're going to vote for him too. How can we give them a JFK phobia called the Catholic card? Because if he's Catholic, he's going to be anti-women's reproductive rights. He's going to be anti-women's rights. He's going to not go along with the kind of integrated society that we have. And so they use Catholic phobia as a tool. I don't believe that they really thought that JFK would really be a puppet of the Vatican. But they knew that it might frighten some women from voting for him. So these parallels, by the way, are important for us so that we can see that this kind of racism just finds new garments. I love the fact in studying Donald Trump, first he throws the Mexicans under the bus. They're all rapists and murderers, right? Then he attacks women, right? Because how they look. So he's objectifying women. It's okay, right? Then he goes for Muslims. Then he goes for the handicapped. Right? What? Right? They came first for the labor organizer. I wasn't in the labor union, so I didn't say anything. I wasn't a socialist. I didn't say anything. I wasn't a Jew. And when they came for me, and that's why I'm saying we need to be an active middle.
Given where we are in the time, I think we're going to turn to some audience questions. We have Claudine and Cassie are here with microphones. Who has a question?
Not a question.
Let's start with questions. So there are some people who've come with some curiosity things that they're not sure of, this is an opportunity to learn something from the panelists. So we'll come back for comments
Or
when
if
we
you're
have some
skillful,
time.
you can make a commentary question.
We'll give you a chance to phrase your comment as a question. Who has a question?
Hi. Thank you. That was a really, really good discussion. I was hoping, we focused a lot on political rhetoric and especially the far right. Could we expand on Islamophobia on campuses? Because we are in a university environment. My undergrad, I experienced a lot of Islamophobia. I call it subconscious Islamophobia, especially with speakers and classes I was a part of. Could we talk about, I guess there's an issue with political correctness and being PC. I think Obama actually came out talking about how students are being more sensitive, he said. If you could expand on that, I don't know if that made sense.
I guess I can speak to that since I was in school not too long ago, but I'm sure both of you can speak to it. So in terms of Islamophobia in academia, I would say that it's not that students are being particularly sensitive. Recently, the State Department actually released a wonderful letter that I was like very surprised about. And it spoke to a lot of the racism and Islamophobia against students here in America, and it was giving kind of suggestions for teachers and professors and academic institutions on how to deal with recent immigrants and how to deal with Muslims, how to deal with students of color, and to understand and acknowledge that their process may not be exactly the same, and to understand that they face bullying at higher rates than other students, and it's not a matter of them being sensitive, it's a matter of they are targeted because they don't fit the white normative identity that is pretty much the status quo of this country. So, you know, I have felt it as a Muslim American visibly student in academia. I've had professors say things of, you know, the nature, it could be a microaggression, it could be extremely subtle, but things like, oh, you'll be the, you know, first person in your family to get a PhD or doctorate, you know, and it's not malicious. I don't think that they say it because they want to hurt me. It's ignorance, honestly, to assume because I am a black woman or to assume that I am a Muslim woman who chooses to cover, who is also an immigrant, that no one in my family is educated, which is not the truth. My parents are educated. My dad has a PhD. All my siblings have gone through college. So these subtle comments are degrading, they're offensive, and they definitely do something to the psyche of young students. So I think that it is something that needs to be discussed. I wouldn't call it sensitivity training because that's really tacky, but I think that there needs to be some sort of workshops that education or that institutions have to undergo to understand that not every student is the same, and microaggressions are a very real thing, and you have to be careful what you say. So, yeah. Did that answer your question, Mubashir? I don't know.
Let me jump in for a minute. Historically, students have been the real change agents in many societies. If we were talking about the so-called Jasmine Revolution, sometimes known as the Arab Spring, right? It's interesting how people on that side of the world called it the Jasmine Revolution, people on the other side, and guess what wins? Arab Spring wins because the hunter is the one who gets to write the history of lion hunting. Dr. King reminds us in a famous speech, and if you've never heard it, I actually believe that maybe after Malcolm X was assassinated February the 21st, 1965, that Dr. King started channeling Malcolm, because he comes out with a position that says I opposed the Vietnam War. And in opposing the Vietnam War, all of a sudden, no longer is he politically correct within the field of civil rights. If we're going to engage in these issues, they actually come up in the context of the current political climate. There's war everywhere. There's Daesh and Islamic State and Boko Haram and whatever. And so we're in that framework.
The KKK.
And, you know, I was at an event, somebody was talking about Somali pirates. I said, well, you know what happened to them, and this is how you connect with them. I said, this is an environmental issue. And if we want to fix the problem of Somali pirates, then the international community should fix the environmental degradation that was done to the fisheries by the toxic dumping off their coast, right? They're doing something that Americans know well, right? It's called catch and release. You go fishing, you catch it, and they say, okay, this fish is too small, you throw them back in. These are people whose fisheries have been destroyed. They now go out and catch people. And then they get money, and they give them back. If we want it to stop, then, but in order to have that conversation, you have to be willing to get into the weeds of what's happening, right? You have to get into the weeds to say, well, what's happening in Iraq and in Syria and so on is a consequence of U.S. and international foreign policy, right? Without, and to say, guess what? As Americans, we never signed on for that. When we got involved with the Vietnam War, most Americans didn't realize at the beginning of the war that we were actually propping up dictators so that we could help international corporations make transistor radios and sneakers. We understand that better now. But that level of depth, that means we have to come out of the ESPN zone just a little more to be able to face the harsh realities and to say, guess what? If people in other countries are attacking us because they hate our lifestyle, it's because the lifestyle that they suffer under is because of the lifestyle that we enjoy. I believe if we can engage that, and I think that's that place of mutuality. You say, you know, brother, well, how would you feel if someone said, well, I'm not involved in that. Why are they angry with it? Said, but we are involved in that. Oh my God. Well, then what can we do? And I'm saying to us now, then it is to challenge the good people that we know. And university students are the best. You have the world's, maybe 90% of the world's sum total of knowledge at your fingertips. Now all you have to do is feel empowered enough that you can do something. This is a shout out to all my hearing impaired brothers and sisters. Oh, somebody said there's something called on campuses hijab and hoodie day. Right. And I'm saying that, when you think about actions that you can take, hijab and hoodie day was a hip thing to do on campus. It pushes the comfort zone so that we can have a dialogue.
I'll say this very briefly because I agree with so much of what has been said, and we do want to allow for other questions. But I think universities, what universities tend to do very well in some ways, as much as they would like to present themselves to the public as places of dialogue and debate and critical thinking, is they delineate the borders of what types of dialogues and debates and critical thinking can take places within those institutions. And I think that is that does a great disservice to a lot of issues that are related to Islamophobia, either directly or indirectly. And I think the issue that is most central to that is the issue of Israel and Palestine. And I think that even mentioning that, I imagine that some of you in the audience and and perhaps some of us on stage kind of bristle, you know, oh God, he just said Israel. Is he really going to go there?
I said it earlier.
Okay, all right. Well, then there we go. All right.
I
So
broke the silence.
It's
So,
okay.
yeah,
we don't
so-
have to tiptoe. I think this is a pretty
Exact-
chill
well-
crowd.
So the issue is tiptoed around quite a bit, and it tends to be one that I think should be addressed head on with a robust debate. We should be talking about the injustices that are carried out daily against the Palestinians, the degree to which their suffering is really not visible in the mainstream media, the degree to which the debate is framed most often and most exclusively in terms of Palestinian or Muslim violence towards Israel, rather than taking the issue of Israel's systematic violence towards the Palestinians to heart. So I'll say that.
And by the way, it is also unpopular on the other side. If I say, Hamas did that? Oh, that's terrible. Right? There is no way that action that was taken against Israeli civilians is acceptable. Right? Muslims will say, how dare you, brother? Don't you know those people are living under occupation? I said, yeah, but they have a moral obligation to be upright, even in the face of the injustice that's in front of them. And that is the place where it's difficult for us to have a conversation. I also want to say something about university life. There was a time when you used to have something as a faculty called academic freedom. Right? Now, university has actually become maybe a kind of vocational training. Students come so that they can get a certificate so they can go out and make money. And the professor's job is to help you hurry up and get your certificate so that then you can cash it in. It is not a place to challenge ideas, right? And if you're a professor and you start doing too much of that, except like in the fairy classes, people who are way out there, they can take those classes. But the real serious students, right, if they take it, it's because they want to get an easy A or something like that. That's why they took the little lightweight course in civil discourse or something. But really they're there just so that they can add another zero to their annual income. That's really what university is about. And because our universities have really lost academic freedom, not focusing on creating people who are critical thinkers, but vocational training, that it's dumbed down the whole process. And that's why we can't have the kind of robust discussion. And I would say that's why our country is in sad shape. Right? Oh, by the way, also we got this other, we haven't talked about it, but it's a part of elephant in the room. I think some of this anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, anti-whatever is really, we're pissed off that we have a black president.
Yes.
We don't want to
co-sign
talk.
that.
We don't want to talk about it. So we talk about everything else, right? Oh, America's weak. What do you mean America's weak? That's the strongest economy, right? I mean, you listen to the State of the Union, right? Right? Oh, I know Obama. And I was like, wait a minute, man. I remember the economy was going in the toilet. Gas was $4 something a gallon. There's that, right? No, it's as if somehow the racism in America can't accept the fact that, well, even though many progressive people don't like what he did, but it was good for the economy. I met soldiers down in Norfolk. White soldier told me we were playing golf. He finally came and he said, you know what? Obama brought us home. Yeah, look around make sure nobody heard him say that, I think that Obama did something good. And I think it's a part of the racism that we don't want to talk about. And by the way, because I don't think, we're not on Twitter or anything anymore. We were live streaming before. If Obama were of another background, it would be okay to say that he is a descendant of Muslims, that he comes from a Muslim family. But because of the Islamophobia that we're experiencing, we all have to collectively accept the fact that we're not going to say that he grew up Muslim, that he went to madrasa. Now, Obama said, I went to madrasa. I'm like, oh, my goodness. That would mean what? That means he's a jihadist. So we all sort of collectively just let it go by. I said, no. If I came from a Jewish family, people would say, I don't care whether he's a practicing Jew or not, Jews would claim him as a non-practicing Jew. Muslims won't claim Obama as a non-practicing Muslim. He left Islam. They can't even say that because it might be bad for the country to say that he grew up praying and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm gonna let it go with that.
Are there any other questions? Okay, we have some, couple, 2, 3.
Operational understanding.
Good evening. Good evening. I want to just thank everybody on the panel. This was definitely amazing. You all brought up points that I think are very important. Two that I thought were very important. You talked about being in the middle, and I was born a Muslim myself, and I was born American. My parents are not immigrants, and we came through the systematic, the American narrative. But my family, they found Islam in the early 60s, and this is how I came into Islam myself. So I'm third, fourth generation. But you talked about being a Muslim in the middle, and I definitely identify this, and I think you brought up being a Muslim in school. I just graduated from the University of Connecticut this past May.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And I suffered a lot, and I was conflicted a lot when I was in school with being a Muslim and being black and going to a predominantly white institution, PWI, and having these different identities. It was, I think, it was a culture shock coming from D.C. going to New England itself, and then carrying all these different identities with me. It was just, just very challenging as a person. And I met some other Muslims on campus who felt the same, who came from similar backgrounds, or who were just Muslims themselves who carried multiple identities, this intersectionality that we spoke about. And now I'm home. So we fast forward, I'm home now, and I'm working, and I'm trying to get into this life of being an adult, and I work for the government. I work for the mayor in D.C., and I work in community economic development, and I see a lot of disconnect with individuals who work in these capacities, who have the ability to affect a lot of change on the community base, on the community level, and literally touch people, really filter information, and let individuals know and really educate people. If there's a disconnect with how to really approach Islamophobia and things of this such. And I think, your name is again, sir? Nathan. Nathan spoke about what I thought was very important, the intersectionality between conflicts. Because I feel as though what I see with the D.C. government is there are a lot of issues that surround Islam in Washington, D.C. that I see with my own eyes, and being a government worker, that are very overlooked a lot of times. And a lot of people complain to me, and they come to me and they tell me they submitted these reports, and I follow up, and these things are missing. So this is confusing me, but my question is, on what level, what can be done on, I guess, a policy level, or in the upper levels of an organization that can educate people and really change the mindset of how to approach Islamophobia? Because I feel as though we don't talk about, everybody supports Black Lives Matter, but, I don't see any of my friends, as fervent about, the war in Syria right now, or what's going on in Pakistan, or what's going on in Afghanistan. I'm like, are these people who are not, being oppressed, who are disenfranchised, who are basically under war? We compare ourselves. If you listen to the Black Lives rhetoric, they make these comparisons to different conflicts around the world, but the masses still shun Islam, or we don't want to know nothing about that. What can be done on a community level, on a level where we can really affect our communities, our organizations, our groups of people, our schools, our governments, to really create an understanding for people to understand how to approach Islam and what the issues really are? Because we talk about it a lot. It's all over the news. Everybody knows about it. But I feel like there's not anything being said. Nothing is really being said about how to really educate people. We just keep talking about, all right, facts. Okay,
Okay.
what about action?
Don't look at me. Hey, looking at me like,
I guess I'll take this question. I work with an organization called Access, and the campaign that I work on is Take on Hate. So it is a campaign that combines issues of Islamophobia, racism, xenophobia, and all the other phobias you can possibly think about, pretty much. And a lot of the actions that we do is solidarity work. So being part of a predominantly Arab organization, we work with the NAACP. We work with black churches. We work with black mosques. We work with institutions that may not reflect the staff that we have or the capacity that we have or some of the core missions that we have. And I feel like that's done a lot of change, not in this community, but in the communities that we work in, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and Detroit. There's definitely been some policy changes. We challenge a lot of these leaders who are trying to push anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant policies, such as Snyder, who is actually a criminal. If you know anything about the water crisis in Flint, that's him. So, you know, we've challenged him on a lot of these anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant policies, and he's backed down. And so I feel that this wasn't done alone just with Take on Hate or Access. This was done with the support of the African-American community, the support of the black churches, which have a lot of clout and power in Detroit. This was done with the Asian American community. This was done with the Latino community. This was done with many communities of color that understand that these policies are not only detrimental to Muslims, Arabs, and immigrants, but detrimental to their civil liberties. And so that, in my opinion, is how to take action, is to do a lot of solidarity work and to look at policies that are damaging not just to your core identity, but to identities of other minorities, and to fight against it.
If I could just add, I think in terms of educating people, one, you've got to make the issue, you've got to make people care about the issue, right? And with an issue like Islamophobia, it's difficult to just, I think, expect that because we care about it, and because it's important to us, it's important, interesting, relevant to other people, right? And so I think part of the way that you do that is, and here I should say that, I mean, there are no magic answers, but if you can connect with people on two levels, take a sort of two-pronged approach. One, connect with them on an emotional level, and then connect with them on an intellectual level. But in that order, emotional and then intellectual, such that they're drawn into the daily experiences of many Muslims around the world, that it resonates, it reverberates with them in a way that they understand that something's wrong, that they're drawn to this issue, that they feel compelled to learn more about it, that they feel a sense of urgency to do something about it. And then when you have them there, you can begin to introduce sort of factual statistics about things like hate crimes, about things related to workplace discrimination, whatever it is, whatever the statistic is, to reinforce the fact that, yes, this is a real thing. Yes, this is something urgent that we as a community need to address, or that we as a workplace need to address, whether it's the D.C. Mayor's office or some other office. But I think that that's maybe a helpful way to think about it, or at least I hope it is.
Because I'm a faith leader, I have to talk, at least say something about, you would expect it. The Quran has a very short chapter where God says that through the passage of time, through the ages, everyone is a loser, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Zoroastrian, whatever they are, إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, except for the people who have a connection with the divine, وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, and they follow it with deeds of righteousness. And so it is about faith and it's about action. So if we were to look at issues like, let's say, for instance, Islamophobia, racism, some really amorphous thing, right? We're going to end racism. Probably we're not going to end it. We can bring up racism and we can challenge racism through this discourse. I'm going to give you, since we're at a university, I'm going to give you some reading. There's a man, his name, he's known in history as Big Ed Chambers. Wrote a book called Roots for Radicals. And Saul Alinsky, who Obama studied under one of his organizations doing organizing in Chicago, Saul Alinsky wrote the book Rules for Radicals. In it, they separate the idea of issues from problems. So you say, okay, the consequence of Islamophobia was some issue that you saw in the DC government. Then you get people, وَتَوَصَّوْا بِالْحَقِّ, who know the truth, وَتَوَصَّوْا بِالصَّبْرِ, and they continue persistently working on driving that particular issue. We looked at the statistics. 9 out of 10 of the people who are like this are discriminated against, while the other ones seem to get effective service. We collect our data, we do our analysis, and we continue to drive that issue home until we resolve it. It is one drop in the bucket in the march toward freedom. But we can't solve the fact that, oh, I don't like certain kind of people. Okay, that's cool, that's your business, right? But you won't be able to discriminate them against them in this particular narrow context. When we win that battle, then we go to the next battle. And by the way, how old are you? As long as you live, the battle will continue. It ain't never gonna be over. It won't, as long as human beings exist. These conflicts are gonna continue to come up. It's gonna be Muslims now, blacks later, some other kind of group we never heard of. The people who are in the middle are going to have to know the truth, have faith, work consistently and persistently, moving, as Dr. King says, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We're not going to fix everything, but working consistently and persistently, organize people and organize money around these issues, and then you begin to feel the power of people. It's the power of people, power of an active citizen. And by the way, in case you didn't notice I was black, slavery didn't end because black people got tired of working for free. White people who had privilege said, you know what? None of us are free until all of us are free. I don't feel comfortable living here while these other people are living like that. It constrains me. I don't feel right. It's the ability for us to work with the people who want to work with the have-nots. And we forgot to mention the power also not only of blacks, but also Jews and others in this struggle.
We've got about a little less than 15 minutes in our time frame, so perhaps if we can take all the questions, if you can keep it really short, and then, I know, and
Well, you know, we can hang around
we
afterwards.
can hang around afterwards,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Release the people who have to go study or something,
Yeah.
write a paper.
So,
School just started.
where's Claudia? So if you could kind of get a theme or a question so that the panel can get as far with it as possible within the time frame, and then some can stay after.
Right.
And
Yeah, maybe we could take like 3 or something
yeah,
like that,
3
and then I
questions,
kind of
and we can
lump them
condense
together.
them, yeah. Yeah.
Hello. I'm just going to ask a very quick question.
We can end with your comment.
Can you guys comment on the mainstream media and how lazy some of their journalism is? They sort of cut and paste. You see people who are suddenly senior terrorism analysts, which I don't know where they got these degrees from. They're throwing around.
Nobody knows.
they're throwing around combination words that don't make sense, jihadist, Salafist, something else. And then you just wonder where these people are coming from. They're writing the narrative, and they're winning the language wars you guys discussed earlier. What can we do to get like positive, moderate voices of the Islamic community that is growing to be shown in the media? Like, there are doctors, lawyers, they actually have lives, and most of them are not foreign, as we were discussing earlier. So can we discuss the intersection of Islamophobia and the media itself, and how that is a specific construct that we need to focus on?
Sorry, yes. My question also relates to the media. The suggestions that you had made in terms of combating Islamophobia dialogue, workshops, those are great, but in reality that takes time, and that takes individual conversations and presumption of the person's knowledge of the region, the religion, the different subsects, geography, all of that. And how do you think the media can come into play, and how do you think rich Muslims around the world, rich countries, can buy in or push their way into the conversation in terms of getting the right information out there to kind of dispel these myths, and what they can do to kind of combat Islamophobia through money, influence, and power?
So this is a common theme. My name is Brandon Ramsey. I'm a sophomore political science and Arabic double major at Howard University. Nope. And so this is awesome because my question also kind of ties into the media. But I also wanted to mention, since the Palestine-Israeli conflict was mentioned, and I do advocacy with, putting forth a two-state solution, that recently the U.S. ambassador to Israel had very harsh words to Israel, and that's very significant because it reflects the Jewish opinion here in the United States that is starting to shift against Israel's military occupation and oppression of the Palestinians. So I just wanted to throw that out there for those that didn't know that. But like what she mentioned, I don't know your name, but I've been thinking, also with regard to the media, that, like he mentioned everything, that it really does shape the narrative. And, if there's a way to hold the media accountable, like, hey, that's wrong, that's not okay. And also, with regard to, Palestine-Israeli conflict, with Islamophobia, with Black Lives Matter, that these topics make the people in power, white people, it makes them uncomfortable, and it makes them feel guilty, and it makes them know that they do have privilege. And I was thinking, is there a way, do you ever see something like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, some sort of pamphlet that kind of outlines, hey, look, this is white supremacy, this is white privilege, this is institutionalized racism, and this is what you should do as a good moral human being to combat it and have equality for others. I don't know, that's just a thought, equality.
Okay, I'm going to mention that we have 10 minutes. Okay, I'm timekeeper, so. And then we're going to end with yeah. Oh, yes. Why don't we? Yes.
Okay,
We do when you're done.
that was
Yeah.
3, so that's pretty good.
Yeah, and then we have a short comment from.
Thank you very much. I have been in contact with many different religions and different nationalities and so on and so forth in my life, which is long, thank God. The similarity between the 3 Abrahamic religions is greater than the differences.
Yes.
But we exaggerate the differences. The same thing. The cultural differences among human beings, where they are Asians or Africans or Europeans or Americans or whatever, if you study what is good and what's bad in every culture, they are so similar. And the majority of the good people are in the middle.
That's right.
But I think one of the unfortunate thing is the good people in the middle in every culture and every religion are inactive.
Yes.
We allow the two extremists to function, and that's why we are failing. So my advice is, people in the middle, get up and have control. You know, there is an ayah in the Quran that says, أدفع بالتي هي أحسن فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة كأنه ولي حميم. When you have a problem, treat with the good action, even if somebody mistreated you. And this will solve the problem. I remember one day I was coming back from the mosque wearing Islamic dress. In the lights, I was crossing the light, and somebody was calling me, Bin Laden, Bin Laden. I thought, and then I waved at him and smiled at him. He did the same.
That's America.
So I think
that's
we
good that
should
he
follow
smiled
that,
and didn't
that
try and
formula, and we will be successful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so I will, Adib has just a short.
Yeah, my name is Adib Yusuf. I don't think Islamophobia is an American problem or so, because to me I think it's bigger than that, and it has no race. If today somebody travel, a Muslim, and my question directly directed to you, Sheikh, if you travel today to Uganda or so, you will be facing the same kind of things. So if you can talk a little bit about the positive things in Islam and the Islamic principle, and so I think.
So turn it to the panel.
I know we're very short on time, so I'm gonna try and be very brief. That was my dad, by the way, who gave the comment over here about religion, and you know. So I guess you can see a little bit of the framework that I have, which is, you know, peace, love, harmony, that we have a lot more in common than we do in differences. And, you know, sometimes I want to like rant and talk about structural racism and de facto issues, and I hear my dad, and it's very humbling, and it reminds me that what we have to do is focus on what we have in common. And to speak to Adib's question about Islamic principles that do discuss peace and positivity, I know that Imam Johari can probably speak to that a little bit more than me, but I recently heard an activist who's a Muslim-American woman discuss the Prophet in a way that I never heard anyone discuss, and I was thoroughly impressed. She said the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was an activist. He was an advocate. He was for women's rights. He was one of the first religious leaders to advocate for women to have their own property, to be able to work, to have agency in a time in Arabia where women were buried as children. So he was one of the first activists for women. And you don't think about that when you hear the Prophet Muhammad. You think of all these other negative comments that people might make. He was welcoming of immigrants. He allowed for other faiths to live amongst him and protected them with his military. So when she framed him as an activist, and when she framed him as an advocate for women's rights and for immigrants and for living together, and also labor wages, there's a hadith, I believe, that says, pay the laborer before the sweat on his forehead dries. So think about that today. Are we getting fair wages for the work that we do today? I don't think so. And these are, you know, conversations that the Prophet was having thousands of years ago, discussing the fact that people need to, you know, have equal wages. And so again, I just thought that that was a very neat framework, that the Prophet would be described as an activist and advocate, and I know that Imam Johari probably has more on the...
I agree with
final comments.
The media. There's an awful lot that can be said about the media, and I think in 2 minutes or less, I'm not going to be able to cover all the bases. But I will say this. I think it's fair to say that Islam is covered in the media as news, right? As news. And Edward Said touched on this back in the 1980s. But other religious communities aren't, right? We don't turn on our television sets and hear of Christian or Jewish
Right, you don't
communities.
think of Billy Graham as news, right?
No, not really news. But if we think about the images and the narratives that come out of the media, they're most always violent. They're most always focused on war. And I think that is because, unlike other prejudices that our country has experienced, dealt with, and is still experiencing and dealing with, Islamophobia is fastened tightly to the banner of Western, mainly American, foreign policy. And until we can begin to discuss Muslims and Islam outside of that context, we're going to continue to have to deal with the repercussions of negative narratives, images, and stereotypes. So I think the best way to make headway is not necessarily to advocate for more Muslim voices in mainstream news media coverage. That's certainly a good option. But I think if we can normalize the experience of American Muslims outside of the context of news, so on the Daily Show, right, Hassan Minhaj and
Dalia
comedians
Mogahed,
like Dalia Mogahed, comedians like Dean Obadallah, musicians like Lupe Fiasco, sports stars like Shaquille O'Neal, and I mean, the list goes on and on. When we can have these public figures not necessarily speak as Muslims or speak about Islam, but just speak about the issues that affect the lives of all of us, whether it's, and to speak about things that we all care about, whether it's, basketball or whether it's comedy or whether it's, food or art or whatever, so that Islam is no longer that news-only thing, right? That we're not talking about Islam as news, but Muslims are then just sort of a normal part of the everyday conversations that we have and that we see in the media.
Hear, hear. Woo! This is some tough love for Muslims. Unfortunately, what gets projected as Islam and is projected quite often by Muslims is a medieval narrative. People riding on camels and having a sword, and I'm telling you, and in that narrative, there is a narrative about, how progressive the Prophet was and how progressive the Quranic narrative was 1,400 years ago. People who began studying within the framework of the, ever consistent Islamic narrative begin to say, wow, you guys are saying that Islam is so modern, but it's rooted in this medieval narrative. And that it's unchanging, and that all Muslims are the same, and blah, 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 all right? And he said, wait a minute. People are beginning to go into hadith literature and say, this is what the Prophet said? And then you say, well, no, wait, no. That's not an authentic interpretation of the hadith. He said, what you just said a minute ago, that all this was solid. It's a critique Muslims have to engage in. To say that a rule that the Quran describes that appears to be discriminatory toward women is not the be-all, end-all. It might be the beginning of the narrative. It's not the end of the narrative. But when Muslims begin projecting Islam as modern from 14 centuries ago, we look really stupid. I remember listening to a news commentator, and Muslims were complaining they're attacking such and such a place during Ramadan. And the reporter said, how can this person say this to me when one of the greatest victories in the history of the Prophet happened in Ramadan? I said, wow. So be careful when you start running, you have to start saying, wait a minute. Islam, in its traditions, are always reviving, always renewing, always critiquing. They're changing while the core values remain the same, right? Human life is valued, et cetera, et cetera. But when we go sort of letter for letter, the Prophet said this. A person sent me a letter and said, I have a hadith that said that the Prophet said if you eat an ajma date, you will never be victim of magic or poison. And then he cites another hadith that he ate some poison that a Jewish woman gave him, and he died. It's like, okay, what am I supposed to believe? Am I supposed to believe this hadith or the other hadith? I'm like, guess what? Not all of that stuff. There's revisionism and other things that happen in Islam just like it happens in every other tradition, and the lay person won't know that. So while we're in this, we really have to be prepared as Muslims to challenge the medieval narrative. I mean, I can say stuff like, I believe that Abu Bakr was wrong. He made a mistake based on my modern contemporary circumstance. And his circumstances might be different. I know we got to go. The Rwandan genocide, since we're talking in a conflict resolution, Muslims wound up being neutral in the genocide. And because people were superstitious and afraid of them, many mosques hid people on the right and the left because people knew that Muslims weren't involved in this conflict. There are many things. I think that we can't rely on foreign money. We need to rely on American money. Your generation needs to pony up. Social media has overthrown governments. Us staying wedded to ABC, NBC, and CBS makes me think that maybe you're too old for the revolution that's happening now. Most of the money that comes from overseas is in the control of dictators anyway. Can I say that? There are a lot of good people in the world. A lot of them are good for nothing. So with that, I'll tell you to be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
I'd like to thank the panelists for their comments. It was a very invigorating discussion and for your attendance. We're going to have an event in Fairfax along similar lines on February, is it the 16th? Interns? Okay, there's my dialogue and difference interns there. So we will be letting various, we'll get that information out as best we can. The panelists will stay as they can and have further discussions. And there's certainly a lot of discussions that we can have and spread the discussion to people that maybe we haven't contacted yet.
As well as use your social media to let, how many of you have Facebook? Raise your hand. Let's not fiddle up. No. Leverage the people that are supposed to be your friends to bring them into this conversation. That's how it happens.
Can I just add a quick point?
Yes, Remaz, of course.
But I believe that dialogue is really powerful. So even if we can't really influence policy in the platform that we want to take place on the Hill or the government.
We can, though, through dialogue.
It's happening.
Yes, it's happening. But I think just the individual interactions are monumental. So I had an encounter with Bernie Sanders and went viral. And I received so many messages of support on Facebook from people across the world. I'm talking about like Belgium, a white woman from Texas who sat her kids down and had a conversation with them about the pillars of Islam, a university professor in London who taught Islam for an entire week.
Power.
And not knowing where it's going to go, who's going to hear it, and how many people will share it. So interact with people kindly. Yes, there are microaggressions of Islamophobia or racism or whatever it is that we're dealing with, but be emotional or engage them emotionally and intellectually. Get them to see you as someone who's not a threat and someone who is like a friend. So if someone sees my hijab and sees it as a symbol of oppression or a symbol of control, I would just, jokingly confront her about the issue. I would say, oh, I like your hair, which is giving me a weird look. And then she'll look at me and she'll just be like, oh my God. I'll say, do you like my hair? I dyed it blue today. And then she'll start laughing. And once people start to laugh, their tension just like goes away, because you've engaged and you showed them that you're not a threat. It's sad that we have to do that, but it's not an apologistic, perspective. But this is sadly what we need to do. And then after that, she will begin to engage you in the conversation. She'll say, so why do you wear that? And then from there, you hope that she can take that conversation elsewhere, and if it be one person or 10, that she can influence with that same dialogue that you started.
Definitely.
Thank you.
And to add to that very quickly, I know that we're leaving, is that when we engage with people, we have to remember, as people who are visibly Muslim, like Imam Johari, myself, Remaz, and a few other people here, is that as Muslims, we need to take some of the advice that we give people. We need to also take a lot of the advice from our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We sit here and we sit in these fancy $1 million mosques. We have a prophet who advocated of the eradication of poverty and was pretty much a socialist of his day, okay? So you can't sit in $1 million mosques with fancy chandeliers. I'm not talking about Dar Hijrah, but
we have a fancy chandelier.
But we do have a fancy chandelier. But I'm saying is to step out of these $1 million mosques. This could also go towards Christianity and the mega churches. Is to actually follow what the religion preaches. If Jesus or the prophet wanted to, have people mobilize in an eradication of poverty, get out of, this situation in your BMW and go ahead and go to homeless shelters, raise money to help the needy. Be an example of what your religion preaches. Don't walk around with a frown. People tell me Muslims look kind of unapproachable and scary. It's because we're sometimes unapproachable and scary looking. And the Prophet, one hadith says, to smile is charity. So to follow the way of our Prophet and to smile and to be welcoming and to be clean as he was and to be kind and to help the needy and to help the poor and to help the disenfranchised and to help the oppressed and the marginalized, that is what our Prophet taught us. And when we start actually internalizing that and creating it into action, then people won't be scared of us.
Some people, no, by the way,
they still might.
Some people will hate you. They'll say, that's a trick. They're trying to trick you into whatever. They're so nice and they're caring and whatever. But I want to invite you all, if you're not organized, get organized. Join an organization, create an organization that can perpetuate this kind of community building work. If you're part of a faith or part of a faith tradition, get involved with some of the people in that to build organization. Because right now, we are being out-organized. Right? When they behead somebody in a country,
that does not represent Islam, FYI, Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. No.
And scholars in America speak out against it. It takes them a week to write their scholarly response, and it takes Daesh seconds to post the refutation of these weak scholars in America. And they're like, where do they get this capacity from? Right? You look at the radical right in this country, Pam Geller, they've got people working. Pam Geller's getting on an airplane, and her Twitter is live. She's posting stuff, and I'm like, I know she didn't write that. There's a machine behind her that's doing it. And I'm saying to you, we are being out-organized on the radical right and on the radical left. The only way you can compete, you have to be organized.
Thank you. So we will wrap it up and then have some discussions off mic.